Why is violence against Asian Americans on the rise? A mass shooting in Georgia is the latest example of what some call a pandemic of racism with deep roots in American history. So what can be done to stop the hate? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. The US President is calling for unity to combat racist attacks on Asian Americans. On Tuesday, a white man shot dead 8 people in massage parlours and spas near Atlanta. 6 of the victims were women of Asian descent. Police have not called it a hate crime, but many say it's hard to see it any other way. A California-based group reported nearly 4,000 cases of harassment and assault on Asian Americans since the start of the coronavirus pandemic last year. Gabriel Elizondo has this report.
Trying to console a nation, President Joe Biden said on Friday evening that hate crimes against Asian Americans needs to stop.
Too many Asian Americans have been walking up and down the streets and worrying, waking up each morning the past year feeling their safety and the safety of their loved ones are at stake. They've been attacked, blamed, scapegoated, and harassed. They've been verbally assaulted, physically assaulted, killed.
The comments came in a previously planned stop by President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris in Atlanta, where on Tuesday 8 people were killed, 7 of them women, 6 being of Asian descent. The alleged gunman, a 21-year-old white man, was arrested and charged with the murders. Investigators have so far resisted calling the murders a hate crime. But on Friday, Vice President Harris, herself of Asian descent, as her mother was born in India, said racism is alive and well in America.
Ultimately, this is about who we are as a nation. This is about how we treat people with dignity and respect. Everyone has the right to go to work, to go to school, to walk down the street and be safe, and also the right to be recognized as an American.
In New York, where there have been more than 10 documented hate crimes against Asians in recent months, a peace vigil was held calling for an end to the violence.
And I really hope this is the culmination of the hate and bigotry that Asian Americans have faced. I pray that there will not have to be another vigil in this seemingly never-ending spate of hate against Asian Americans.
President Biden and Vice President Harris planned a political rally on Friday night in Atlanta, but decided to cancel it and instead met with members of the Asian American community in the wake of the tragic shootings. Gabriel Elizondo, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, former US President Donald Trump has been blamed for fueling hate against Asians.
When the China virus invaded our shores, Corona-19, the China virus, Kung Flu, I can name 19 different versions of names.
Yes, he repeatedly used racist terms to describe COVID-19. Some say, though, it's not all Trump's fault. This comedian's tweet pointed to a long history of xenophobic jokes in popular culture, and historians say sentiment against Asians has been in the United States since the arrival of the first immigrants back in the 19th century. All right, let's first talk to Calvin Sun, who's an emergency physician in New York City, about his experience as an Asian American working in the current climate. Calvin, thanks for joining us here on Al Jazeera. As I say, you're an Asian American doctor. You're a staunch advocate of Asian American rights. What were your thoughts, first of all, when you found out about these deadly attacks?
When I first found out about these attacks, which attacks? The ones that I grew up with when I was growing up in New York City 34 years ago. Are you talking about the attacks this week? It's exasperation. It hasn't changed. Nothing has changed. If anything, they've gotten worse, but it's just getting more attention. I've always said about the pandemic, our healthcare system, all the problems in our healthcare system were not new problems. A pandemic just clarified them. And it just seems that it's just doing the same thing for these decades, generations and generations of trauma that are, people intersectionally, not just Asian Americans, but all people of color and people who have been oppressed, since the dawn of time have been, just been highlighted. And I think we're just getting more attention, and because the vehicle and the lens in which it's portrayed through the pandemic has been just been brought to the forefront of the mainstream. So we're finally getting our 15 minutes, but I worry that it's only going to last for so long before people start forgetting or scapegoat us further.
All right, so it's always been there, but to what extent do you think, what we just heard from the former president just then, what do you think, how much has he fanned the embers of this with the rhetoric that he's been using?
It definitely didn't help. I mean, I'm a big believer that every little bit counts, bottom up, top down. We need all the help that we can get, and all sometimes people need when they're going through whatever they're going through is that push, whether it's from a leader they look up to or a background tension of being through a pandemic, all these years and years of this racism or this discrimination or all these things that they have an antagonism towards and want to take it out on someone, scapegoat of people, can bring up to the forefront with a little push from words of a leader that they never met before but look up to. So definitely the rhetoric of an administration that we voted out that only, if anything, help hurt us even more of something that's been existing long before that they've been around.
Give us a sense of what it's like to those of us who haven't experienced this, what kind of racism you have personally faced, what kind of things are said or happen.
It's all from the big things and obvious things. I mean, everyone would notice a grandmother being punched in the face. Mm-hmm. Those people who watch those images on the screen can relate to the pain and trauma that they would feel, that obvious violence. And it boils all the way down. But think about all the factors, those micro behaviors that led to those obvious actions that people feel right now. Think about all the little microaggressions and behaviors. And a lot of people are like, microaggressions, I heard that word before. And it's like, what does that mean? And it's all those things where people have good intentions, but have bad behavior. We judge others by their behaviors and only ourselves by our intentions. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. People may come to you with good intentions, seemingly to say nice things, to want to compliment you, but the actions ends up running over my foot, and end up hurting me. And ultimately, that's what we judge others by, their behaviors, how much they have harmed us, even if the intentions are good. But you may have good intentions and break my foot by running over it with your car. My foot is still broken. It doesn't help me any further. I'm the one injured. Even if you have the best of intentions, I am now deeply hurt or permanently injured by these well-intentioned behaviors that ended up harming us. And all those little factors, where it's not quite really understanding where we truly are from, even though I'm born and raised in New York, whether it's not really truly understanding that we are as American as anyone else around us, and not understanding that we're not a perpetual foreigner, and even the small little behaviors that you have that we are very sensitive to, knowing that you never would ask someone else that is an Asian American where they're truly from, whether they're truly American or not, or even the way you behave towards them, that you're subconscious, the subconscious bias, where it's the same thing as how we treat black and brown brothers and sisters out there, when people act a certain way when they clutch their purses a little tighter or they feel a little more unsafe around them. And they are sensitive to that, and that adds up to all the tension that builds up, that boils over when you have an administration or a leader that says the if you will, right, but I think the wrong thing, that is the straw that broke the camel's back.
All right, Calvin Sun, appreciate that. Thank you for your insight. This window on your life as an Asian American. Thanks very much. Well, fascinating to get that perspective, wasn't it? But let's move on to our panel now. From San Bernardino, we have Brian Levin, who's director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University. And from Monterey Bay is Chrissy Lau, who's a historian and assistant professor at California State University. Welcome to you both. Great to have you here on this important story. Chrissy Lau, first of all, so as we've been hearing, racism against Asian Americans is nothing new. give us a very brief overview of its deeper history, if you would. It goes back to the very origins of modern America, doesn't it?
Yes, anti-Asian violence is nothing new. What we've seen in Atlanta are part of larger and longer patterns of anti-Asian violence. This dates back to anti-Chinese violence during the 19th century, the passage of the 1875 Page Law that was directed at banning Chinese women, but in practice ended up stereotyping all Chinese women as prostitutes. We continue to see banning Japanese immigrants with the 1924 Immigration Act. And then in the middle to late 20th century, we see U.S. imperialism in Asia and the establishment of military camp towns in Korea that condoned and perpetuated sexual violence against Korean women during the Cold War and in other U.S. wars in Asia. And so all of this history deeply informs what we saw happen in Atlanta and why historians are calling for the fact that racism and sexism must be understood as part of the factors that contributed to this hate crime.
Right, so there is this kind of underlying seam, if you like, of racism that's always there, but Chrissy can erupt at any moment, as we've seen.
There are particular moments. We've seen anti-Asian violence that arise during Great Depressions, like the 1930s Watsonville riots, where white mobs chased out Filipinos because of the global depression that was occurring. And even during now, we are in the midst of a depression. There are people who are out of work. And then our former president tries to pin the blame by racializing the virus and called it the Chinese flu. And this enabled white mobs to start attacking Asian Americans across the U.S. Stop AAPI Hate, an organization, has tracked that there were 3,800 reports submitted to them. Many of them were acts of hate towards Asian American women. And so Asian Americans are scared during this time period.
Brian Levin, so for the past year or more, since the pandemic began, really, we've seen this spike in Asian American hate crimes. Give us an idea of what you're seeing and if it represents a true picture of the scale of the problem.
Thank you. And let me just begin by saying we stand in complete solidarity with our Asian American brothers and sisters today, just like we did decades ago when we started the center, and we're not going to stop. We stand with you. Now, if I can answer your question, we started seeing, particularly in early March, the convergence of two things. One, an escalating number of hospitalizations, particularly in New York City, which had the most anti-Asian hate crimes of any of the official reports that we've gotten. And in answer to a part of your question, what we're getting with reports is minuscule compared to what we know is occurring across the country. And that's why our friends at Stop AAPI Hate really illustrate just the breadth of it. But we have some really interesting data that really fits hand in glove with that. So what we saw is around the beginning of March an increase in these hospitalizations. But we also saw, for instance, a congressman on March 8th make stigmatizing ethnic statements with regard to COVID. And then around the same time, Secretary of State Pompeo, on March 16th, President Trump started using these terms, and he used it about 24 times through March 30th. So we saw hate crimes go up along with that at the same time. And many times offenders have said things that mimicked what they heard from these leaders. So that was terrible. So in New York, for instance, 12 out of the 28 hate crimes that they had last year were in March alone. And what we saw is just in 16 cities alone, 122 hate crimes, and that was a 149% increase over the previous year. We're talking historic surges in this.
All right,
and
so,
that's something that we are very concerned
certainly
about.
seems to correlate with Donald Trump's rhetoric. So, Chrissy, there is a suggestion out there that these attacks may not have been directly racially motivated, that this could be more about the man's angst against his sexual addiction. But that in itself raises a question about how Asian American women are perceived.
There is a longer history of hypersexualization of Asian American women. I did discuss that the Page Act in 1875, which stereotyped all Chinese immigrant women as prostitutes. And then U.S. imperialism in Asia really re-solidified the stereotype of Asian women as prostitutes by condoning sexual violence in military camp towns. So this idea of a sexual addiction actually carries on this rhetoric of treating Asian American women as objects, as beings that need to be objectified or hypersexualized. A lot of this is continued through U.S. popular culture, movies, TV, and social media. And so this hypersexualization plays a huge role in casting the idea that Asian massage parlors, Asian workers are a sexual addiction. And might I add that massage work oftentimes is stereotyped as sex work, but massage workers might not necessarily consider themselves sex work, but this Orientalist conflation is part of the problem.
Right. Brian, do you think that attacks against Asian Americans are called out enough for what they are? Are they recognized as hate crimes as such?
No, absolutely not. And unfortunately, this is occurring not only in the white community, but it's something that affects everyone. Once that bigotry, that white supremacy or the misogyny gets out there, that toxic smoke spreads throughout the society. And one of the things that our research has found is that when leaders like Vice President Harris and President Biden, who just this week condemned this type of violence, when they make those statements, it actually correlates to changes in behavior. So for instance, couple of quick examples. 6 days after 9/11, President Bush spoke of tolerance. Hate crimes dropped precipitously the next day into the next year. Similarly, when we saw rhetoric against Muslim people by the president after the San Bernardino terror attack, which affected our community, hate crimes spiked another 23% on top of what we saw from the terror attack. One last quick thing. Listen to this. On March 23rd, President Trump uncharacteristically spoke of tolerance after a DHS report said, hey, Asians are going to be targeted here, Asian Americans. And you know what? On that one day where he tweeted and spoke of tolerance, we didn't have anti-Asian hate crimes in New York or Los Angeles on that day. But then the next day or two, he started doing it again. And we saw a continuation of these terrible attacks against our Asian American brothers and sisters.
Yes, go figure. I suppose that's the thing, Chrissy, isn't it? If rhetoric can harm, it can also heal. And Biden's approach is the polar opposite to that of Donald Trump.
Well, I want to highlight the on-the-ground organizing by Asian American community organizers, activists, artists, professors that have done the work to reframe the narrative, to identify that racism and sexism are huge factors in this hate crime, where law enforcement, police officers, and national leaders were unwilling to call it a hate crime.
Right. Now, so we get to this point now where Asian Americans have been ringing the bell on this issue for so long and raising the red flag. And, you know, as we've seen over 200 years and more, that nothing has actually changed. So what now, Chrissy, must be done?
Asian Americans have called for solidarity with Asian Americans. Educate yourselves on the history of anti-Asian violence. Take bystander trainings. Check in with your Asian American friends and neighbors. Volunteer to walk with Asian Americans if they if they allow you to, going to supermarkets or elderly that are walking there are community organizations that are organizing around pairing elderly folks so that they're not walking alone. Destigmatizing sex work, supporting sex workers' rights, giving a living wage to service workers, to nail salons, to massage parlors, destigmatizing some of their care work, and then understanding care in a broader sense that these massage parlors are respectable work, and they are work that should be paid a living wage.
And Brian, from a legal perspective, is the law in America actually capable of accounting for the many ways in which Asian Americans experience racism in the United States?
Not enough. We have to have non-Asians stand up and say, this is wrong, this is un-American, and as we've seen, these messages from the top carry weight. But also, one thing I can tell you, our community was attacked in a mass killing, and it's important for the whole community to stand up for these victims and recognize this attack for what we believe it to be, irrespective of the limits of the law. Here in the United States, one has to prove in court, beyond a reasonable doubt, motive. So let's let this investigation continue and at the same time acknowledge the pain and the intersectionality that often exists with hate crimes. We had many transgendered people killed in the United States last year, a recent high. And that intersection was a lot of people of color, Black people who are also transgendered. And I think we're seeing another example here. You can have a hate crime that has one or two or multiple causes, and you can have an intersection between race and gender, for example, and we stand with our fellow citizens and residents of this country because this is un-American, and we have to speak out. Those who are not members of the Asian American community and say, this is not reflective of what our national ideals and aspirations are.
Chrissy, if I could end with you, tell the world about how your daily life, how much it's affected by this kind of racism, and how urgent it is and how important it is that a solution is sought.
I've been grieving with my Asian American communities, and it's been a very sad time. I have family in Atlanta. My aunt works 3 blocks from the site of the killings and the murders. I have cousins, I have friends in Atlanta who are scared. And so I feel all of this deeply. And I am part of an organization known as the Anti-Sewing Squad. We are a collective of sewers that have made masks at the start of the pandemic. We send our homemade masks to the communities that are most vulnerable and have been the most impacted, specifically by POC communities that have suffered from histories of disenfranchisement. We prioritize their health and safety by sending those communities masks. And so as part of the Anti-Sewing Squad, we put out a statement standing in solidarity with the murdered spa workers and really calling for a reevaluation of how we treat service workers in industries like massage parlors, nail salons, and other service jobs. We need to respect their work. We need to care for them. We need to treat them as human beings. And also, we need to identify a longer history of racism and sexism and call for more creative solutions. And we oppose an increased reliance on policing.
Okay. Both, we appreciate your time. We've run out of it, but we do appreciate your time in focusing on this important, crucial story. Thank you so much. Chrissy Lau and Brian Levin, and earlier Calvin Sun. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see this and all our previous programs again by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.